recorded. And okay, we're recording. So thank you for joining us at this HNPW conference. The topic we are suggesting to discuss today is Bridging the Gap, how to prevent a two-tier humanitarian data system. It's built on recent reflections from CartONG that I will present in a minute. And we have invited a panel of different participants from the humanitarian system to both discuss the current situation of the sector and also try to think a bit of future evolutions. We are trying to have interactive sessions, so I will show you a bit later in the presentation a tool that we will use so you can participate. So I hope you have a smartphone or a computer ready with internet. You can connect to the conference centers with Wi-Fi for the people on site. And so without further ado, I will get started on the presentation. So we'll start, as I said, with introduction on CartONG study and how it will frame the discussion. Then we'll have some key questions to our three panelists, and then we'll have a more open discussion with the room. So to start with, so as I said, my name is Martin. I work at CartONG. I'm a fundraising and research officer, and I'm the lead author of the studies that we will be seeing afterwards. And joining us today, we have Kito Tsui, who is a research consultant at the MELTEC initiative. So Kito, if you want to introduce yourself and your organization.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's a shame we can't see you all, but I'm sure the room is full. Really nice to meet you all. I'm Kito, I work at the MELTEC initiative. I'm a researcher and writer focused on the use of tech in complex deployment contexts. And at the MELTEC initiative, I've been focused on the humanitarian sector and prior to that for quite some time now. The MELTEC initiative focuses on monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning in relation to technology, so both the use of tech within those processes and also how to think about monitoring, evaluating, etc. Around tech tools. So our practice is about emphasizing the importance of responsible use of tech and data by nonprofit actors and trying to help them think about ways to do so that align with their mission. So really excited to be here today.
Thanks, Kito. And then with us is Giulio Coppi, Senior Humanitarian Officer at Access Now.
Thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone. I work with Access Now, that is an organization working to protect and expand digital rights worldwide. I try to focus on the intersection between humanitarian frameworks and human rights frameworks, supporting my colleagues' work and our partners' work when it comes to dealing with treacherous ambiguities or challenges that come from the application of digital rights protection in situations of conflict and violence. This includes issues emerging from the prospective use of lethal autonomous weapon systems or the use of AI in the humanitarian sector, or surveillance, the fight against shutdowns in conflict areas, and documenting the impact. All these topics that are usually a little bit neglected because they fall in between the two different frameworks. Back to you.
Thanks a lot. And finally, our last minute guest, thanks for joining us, Abdullah Hamedi, who is Director of the Afghanistan Democracy and Development Organization.
Thank you so much, Martin. Hello, everyone. As you mentioned, my name is Abdullah Ahmadi. I am Director of Afghanistan Democracy and Development Organization, or we call ADDO. ADDO is working for promoting and protecting of human rights and democracy value in the past, but now mostly we are involving on digital security, digital right, as well as in some humanitarian work with the women to empower them. ADDO is working inside Afghanistan as well as registered in France, and I'm happy that today I am in this event as a panelist, and I will talk about some challenges, some risk and opportunity related to the data management related to humanitarian activity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Abdullah. So as I was mentioning earlier, I will start the this panel discussion with a short presentation, so don't worry, it won't be too long. Just to frame a bit the issues around the studies that CartONG published a couple of months before, which is called Beyond the Numbers, Balancing Innovation, Ethics and Impact. It's a study on, I would say, the state of the art of the data management in the humanitarian sector. And I think it can bring some insights on what will be next in the discussion. So, just a few words about CartONG because I didn't introduce us at the beginning of the panel. So we are an NGO supporting other humanitarian organizations working on the humanitarian and international development sector, specifically on data management, mapping, GIS, information management, etc. We consider ourselves, I would say, as a think and do tank. So we are studying the datafication of the sector and its evolution. And we are also practicing it through support organization, assessments, monitoring, evaluation, etc. The study I'm going to present was part of a project funded by the French Development Agency to support the data management practices of civil society organizations or NGOs. And we are targeting in this study the humanitarian and international development NGOs or CSOs. So as you'll see, some of the learning also apply to UN organizations, international organizations or governments, but it's mostly focused on NGOs. So I hope it will be relevant for you. As you can see on the bottom here, some key information around how we built the learning from this study. So we did a broad literature review. We shared a survey with quite a lot of different organizations and did some interviews with key participants and a workshop to discuss also with some specific audiences. So now back to the study. The first thing I wanted to say is that exploring the use of data in the humanitarian sector, of course, we know that the volume of data is exploding currently. Like if you check our studies in the past 15 years, the volume of data overall in the world has multiplied by more than 40, and it's in a continuous trend of very fast augmentation, increase. But we still lack evidence of impact of data, specifically on the humanitarian sector. Like we reviewed a study from ALNAP who found out that like they reviewed a broad range of humanitarian innovation, including most of them were on data topics, but not only. And they found out that only 16% of them had solid evidence of impact of this innovation. So when we ask participants, we find out that most of the time they still collect data for upwards accountability. So they produce data for donors, basically, or for their official counterparts. We still lacked a bit evidence on the impact of like what we could call like revolutionary, it's a big word, tools. Like for instance, there is very few proof of impact of tools like drones or blockchain or biometrics. Like we see sectorial use that have a very strong impact, for instance, biometrics for cash distribution or this kind of stuff, or blockchain also. But in general, like the broad panel of international NGOs, and especially the local ones, are still not using a lot of these advanced tools. There are still very basic and important gaps in data quality and biases in the way we produce data. So I'm sure, or I hope you're familiar with the work of Clear Global on the issue of language, and like they do some very revealing studies on the fact that like most of the data around the world is still collected on language that is not the language of the people, the affected people, and even like the people that collect the data, like the enumerators, are usually not speaking in their native language, which can create a whole lot of biases. We have similar question on the gender question, of course. And there is still a very deep underuse of qualitative and secondary data. Like most of the organizations we ask for are still saying that this is something that needs to be developed, but that is not developed yet, even though we see now, and that's one of the very promising fields of use of intelligent artificial tools that are doing that. And so on the bottom, you have a chart that is illustrating the aspect I was mentioning around accountability, which is still mentioned as the first reason to collect data by 3/4 of our panel, far before decision making in the field, actually. We also try to assess a bit the level of professionalization and skills of the sector in terms of data management. So what we can see is that data or program data is more and more used as a concept and as a field of work. Basically, we have more and more organizations that have either professionals or functions linked to that. A strong development of the skills within organization, but mostly still the basic skills, in particular for local NGOs. Like we see, for instance, the type of tools that growth the most since we did the last study in 2020 was GIS, actually, which is in a way quite a basic technology. And for many organizations, the main challenge I see now, it's not so much technical skills, but more the organizational capacity to embed the information management functions within the organization. So something linked, to the big question of data literacy. Like you have a few specialists that are really up to the point in terms of using this or that technology, but it's not transpiring around the organization and on the decision-making function. That being said, we see some progresses because even though we don't have exactly the same panel between a survey we did in 2020 and 2024, you can see that for a quarter of organizations now, they think they have a sufficient digital or complete digital literacy among their team members, whether they are employees or volunteers, whereas 4 years ago, it was less than 5%. So our samples is what was its worth, we had around 60 organizations answering, so it's of course not the whole sector, but we can still see this improving trend. In terms of needs of the organization and then the sector, so what we saw is really complementary to the skills aspect is that there are a lot of tech solutions existing, and now the challenge of most organizations not necessarily to acquire the tech, but more to identify what is relevant for them. There is still a strong lack of funding for all things needs assessments, defining what sustainable solutions for work for them. Most of the time, the NGOs are still acquiring a specific solution when they need it for a project, but without thinking long term and without proper time and funding to build a sustainable solution. And so what our surveyed organization told us is that for them the goal is not so much to produce new resources or support offers, but to make them available to those who need it, in particular local organizations. There is a whole panel of organizations, including CartONG, that can provide support, but we are not reaching most of the local organizations yet, and make it relevant to their specific constraints. So we put here a few graphs from our study. You can see it in the detailed study, of course, but as you can see in terms of tech priorities, what they identified as top priorities was first responsible data management. We'll talk about it later. AI, of course, but then quite a lot of things that are, as I said, more linked to process and data qualities and really tech implementation and tech skills. And to conclude on this introduction, we will rediscuss it with the questions afterward, and that's why we chose this name for the session today. We identified as part of the study the risk, and here you can see a mapping of the sector, which is quite, of course, simplified, but just to give an idea of its complexity too. The risk of a two-tier humanitarian data system. What we meant by that is that we increasingly see a group of organizations, which are the big international NGOs, UN agencies, the donors and global north institutions that are capable of coping with technology advances, that are capturing the top skills staff, that can acquire funding from major donors because they have all the accountability processes in place. Basically, that are navigating the innovation and technology sector and not supporting it and having to cope with it. And on the other side, you have, basically all the rest, which is actually many of the NGOs, including international NGOs from the global north, but the smaller ones, not the very big ones, all the national and local organizations, or almost all of them, and also many institutions from the global south, like, for instance, National Statistics Officer, etc. And all these organizations, of course, they have a lot of skills and they are really interested to go further, but they struggle to capture funding, they struggle to retain the talents because the most skilled people are recruited by the bigger organizations, and most of the time innovation is kind of forced to them because of accountability reasons, etc. So linking to also the question I highlighted before, that most of the time they are collecting data for accountability more than for their own operation. So this is in a very synthetic way, and I have a few paper versions of the study for those in the room, and you can find it online for the remote attendance. A very broad synthesis of what we explored around the state of the humanitarian system regarding data nowadays. Of course, so our study was published in October, so a lot have happened since then. And the idea of today is both to dig a bit on some of the questions here, and also to, well, try to see how the recent course of events will impact these different questions. And before we move to the discussion, just some teasing again on the study. So we'll be exploring today some of the key stakes that we discussed in the study, but some of are not. And so as you can see here, we are exploring in our study quite a lot of stakes around the humanitarian data sector. And so you are really strongly encouraged, of course, to check it if you are interested. And now I will move to the second part of the session, which is opening questions to our panelists. So my first question will be to our expert, Giulio. So the question is, should the ongoing upheaval of the aid sector, so all the context that you know, change the approach of humanitarian actors towards technology? It's a big and broad question, but I'm sure Giulio will be able to give us some key insights.
Thank you, Martin, and apologies everyone, because Zoom decided to shut down my video, so that was not on purpose. I was fearing that might happen, so yeah, apologies for that. The question is indeed very broad. I do think that there is a lot of discussion being thrown around in terms of opportunities and challenges of the current scenario, which actually deletes or erases the dramatic consequences of the period that we are living for so many people, including local staff that see basically no opportunity whatsoever in what is going on. There is basically people losing their jobs, their livelihood, their employment, their hope for the community. So I will. This is the opening answer. The opening answer is that I will, invite all of us to step back a little bit from the typical reaction of challenges of opportunities framework and the framing that is slightly, insensitive in a way and a bit cynical, and maybe try to rather focus on what does it mean in terms of rebuilding, and first of all, trying to regain the trust from local partners, local communities, and organizations. What will be needed to get back from this, and in terms of repairing the harm done to local communities because of the interruption of funding that was based on a system that everybody said it was unsustainable. Everybody said that it should have been changed. We can talk about the World Humanitarian Summit. This was one of the key priorities. We can go back in time as long as I can remember. This was something that everybody agreed should have changed, and it has not been changed. So the question that I will maybe frame today, well, the way that I will frame the answer to the question that you made, Martin, is rather, where are the available proposals for a more ethical, responsible, and locally driven humanitarian response? There are a few options. There are a few avenues that have been explored recently. Most of them, unfortunately, do not seem to find correspondence in the ongoing craze for AI and cloud-based systems. Let's be frank. Most of the current trends go towards the hype for clouds and technologies, which are centralizing in nature, usually. That means more extractive practices. That means more data siphoned out of local environments, outside of potentially protective environments, into big commercial data sets where it will be trained and used for further large language model training. And the opening of a new attractive market for these companies. Most of them have been dropping the mask since the Trump administration came into action, sprang into action, and destroyed the current system. Most of these companies have been dropping the mask and trying, kind of showing their true selves and dropping human rights policies, humanitarian commitments, or removing specific topics such as working with queer communities or LGBTQI plus programming or gender-based or climate-based studies and research and programming. All this is gone quietly or loudly. And this, again, it sends a strong signal to partners and especially local affected communities that we as a sector cannot be trusted. We'll turn our back together with our tech partners as soon as the money dries out. And there have been very little that has been done by big actors to gain or to protect that trust and to protect their partners. So this is where I will take as a starting point for the discussion, and I'm sure my colleagues will further and better expand this. But I would say that the age of innocence, if it ever existed, is over. And we need to face the fact that international NGOs are failing at their basic task of protecting local staff and communities because their system was built on dependency from a few solid donors. And their role when it comes to tech has proven to be more of an intermediary that tries to capitalize on the access to funds rather than a real true power broker that can facilitate the access and the protection for local actors and communities when they need to access the negotiation table with big tech companies and actors. And I think I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Julio. I think that's a really complete response already to such a broad question, and it's a really good conversation opener, if I can say. Before we move to the next question, I just wanted to bring a couple of additional insights from our study. The first one is a quote that was found by the organization called Development Initiatives that you might know. They closed in the autumn, which is really a pity because they are really doing really great work on analyzing the data ecosystem globally. And they found out this brief from the Information Technology Industry Council, which is basically the coalition of the big tech companies in the US, which was saying up front, and this is from last year, that at some point the US will have to cut aid to countries that impose data localization or other digital protectionist tools. So I find it very interesting to see that this agenda was already planned by big tech companies even before Trump's election. And this is a bit what we are seeing materializing now. And at the same time, to not depict a completely gloomy portrait, again, back from the ALNAP study I was referencing before, they were highlighting that despite the fact that there is not a lot of evaluation of the innovation in the humanitarian sector, and also there is a critical lack of funding for scaling up innovation, we can see really great achievement from humanitarian technology innovation, especially the one rooted in local organization, of course. One interesting quote thing they mentioned in this study is that the paper industry, so production of paper, has a higher research and development budget proportionally than the humanitarian sector, just to show you the gap in terms of innovation funding in the humanitarian sector. So we see that there are opportunities and capacities, but at the same time, we see all the constraints that are coming, especially at the global level. And now to our second expert, Quito. So the question is quite connected, actually. As you can see, they are all linked, but taking a slightly different approach, talking about responsible data management. So for you, what new challenges and existing challenges appear for the humanitarian organization in the current context?
Yeah, I think Julio set this up really well because I think it's maybe less about new challenges to a degree and more about how the current moment has sharpened the importance of responsible data management, and I think exposed certain assumptions that underpin that I think probably ought to have been, some were already questioning, but probably ought to have been questioned a lot longer ago. I think the sector took sort of the bounds of known safety for granted, right? Like that Europe is a safe place to store data, or that the global north more broadly is safer than having this data stored locally, and obviously many other assumptions besides that. And I think that the security in the sector has been to a degree built on those assumptions about the geopolitical landscape remaining as it is. That is a safer way to engage and a better way to understand, but also that the status quo of data protection in certain spaces was hard fought and not a given. That I think there was an assumption that these things would remain static, right? When actually they were all already relatively fragile. And I think based on a set of biases about where we think information is safe, where we think certain values around data privacy and so on are better protected, right? And what I think we now see, like the recent events that demonstrates that things can change very rapidly in these supposed safe havens, like that they can't be relied upon, and that actually a lot of the risks that data protection folk have been talking about for a long time that were dismissed because of a lack of evidence or insufficient amount of evidence, according to folks doing the dismissing, right? That actually a lot of that is now happening, right? And it shows how hard it is to protect data fully and the myriad of ways in which it can be imperiled, right? When a lot of times we think about this kind of more like in the cloud, intangible ways of protecting data as part of responsible data management, which is necessary, to be clear. We focus on cybersecurity and so on, and overlooked and kind of started to move away from thinking about hardware concerns as part of responsible data management, right? But actually the seizure of physical databases from USAID demonstrates that that is still an incredibly salient and pressing issue, and that we shouldn't, again, assume that in certain places data can't be imperiled in that way. When to responsible data management practices maybe elsewhere, certainly I think in deployment context would assume that would be a potential issue. So I think there's a real discrepancy between how humanitarians have thought about the risk landscape in different places. And I think one of the new challenges is sobering up to the fact that I think some of those differences are a lot smaller, but also that, again, the underpinning logic of it, I think, is very much up for questioning, right? That the politicization of tech is now a lot clearer, as I think Julia already spoke about, right? And that humanitarians need to be better prepared, therefore, for a more hostile and dynamic operational environment. So it makes it even more important that they have independence and tools, independence in the tech landscape and tools that are separate. So that when we think about responsible data management, it's not just utilizing tools that are given to organizations, which already is something that is being discussed, right? Like off-the-shelf tools not being fit for purpose, but actually thinking a lot more about the risk that introduces, the big tech reliance, obviously the exposure to shifting dynamics in a geopolitical landscape. And also, I think more importantly, that it reinforces, and I think this comes across really nicely in the CartONG report, right, is that it's really important to have the fundamentals down. It's necessary to be prepared. And I think to press on humanitarian organizations to reflect a lot more on the necessity of data collection. Like I know that data minimization is not a new thing, but I think it's something that kind of fell away to a degree because the sector is quite addicted to collecting data, frankly, right? Like the price of engaging with assistance, right, for a lot of communities is handing over enormous amounts of their data. That the Julio's Access Now report, I think, does a really good job of understanding and explicating what the kinds of risks could be related to that. So in terms of I don't think it's a challenge to return to that, but I think it's about really getting back to basics that we already know from responsible data management and to pick up on these threads that maybe fell away, especially as the AI push that has already been mentioned is starting to rear its head, right? We have a Meltec, a humanitarian AI working group, and I think it's quite clear in that group there's an emerging fork in the road for those who think that this current moment means that we should move more towards saving resources, and that means using more AI tools, and those who think that actually we should be spending money on these vast AI infrastructures that expose humanitarians and the data that they are collecting and holding. So ultimately, I think it's a time that reinforces how important responsible data management is, but it's also, I think, important to look back at the responsible data management that we maybe are taking for granted right now or have been using up until this point, and the ways in which that has blinded the sector or kind of put blinkers on the sector to areas of risk or areas of places where risk could emerge where folks felt like that was already settled. So I think it's a real wake-up call about the importance of preparing for uncertainty and not assuming that certain places are safe, and also that humanitarians need to have more resources to support them. Obviously, it's really difficult in this current environment, but they need the resources to be doing responsible data management. And in the absence of that, given what we have seen, need to be rethinking very hard how much data they're collecting, why they're collecting it, who they're sharing it with, and if it means that they can't protect this properly, to take a step back from collecting that much data. So I'll pause. I think I've talked for a while, but apologies.
No, no worries. Super relevant. And actually, I won't have much to add on this. Is like, as you were saying, the dimension of going back to fundamentals. This is a graphic from our studies that shows the 4 dimensions of responsible data management, both in terms of confidentiality, security, literacy, data literacy, and data quality. And this can be a bit overwhelming, as you mentioned, for organization, but there is also the option, as you were mentioning, of data minimization, So we wanted to highlight the fact that it's not because we are in a difficult situation and some organization might be closing operations, etc. It doesn't mean we can and have a possibility to drive away from that, because it's part of the humanitarian do no harm mandate to abide with this responsible approach at all time. And our final question to expert, to Abdullah. So Abdullah has a difficult task to be speaking for all the local and national organizations worldwide. Of course, he will be speaking about his own organization example, but we think it's quite relevant as an example to discuss the risk and opportunities for local and national NGOs and for local and national humanitarian agencies of the current situation in terms of data management. Over to you, Abdullah.
Thank you so much, Martin, and hello again, everyone. This is a very important question, the risk and opportunity for data management, especially in the humanitarian sector. Let's start with the risk and then about on the opportunity. One of the main risks for the local NGO in the data management, by considering my experience in Afghanistan and maybe other organization, is the first one is digital inequality and the resource limitation. Many local NGOs face significant challenge due to limited resource, outdated technology, and the lack of the technical expertise, while international organizations are deploying advanced AI tools or other innovations. But local actors are often stuck with the traditional method like paper-based data collection, which is practiced in Afghanistan, and we have witness of that. In Afghanistan, humanitarian organizations often operate in the area with the limited internet access and face security risk. Many local organizations still rely on the paper-based method, which slow down response times and increase the chances of error. I think we need target investment in the digital infrastructure and the training to help local NGO on this bridge, this digital divide. And the second risk, based of my experience and my area, is related to data governance and ethical issue. Many local NGOs do not have control over the data they collect, as it is often stored on the international control platforms. This becomes especially problematic when the international organizations pull out of the crisis regions, leaving the local actors without access to the critical data. For instance, after USAID funded program were shut down in Afghanistan, many local NGOs lost access to important data stored on the foreign platforms. This effect severely impact their ability to respond effectively, leaving thousands of vulnerable individuals without accessing the support. I think local NGOs must have control over their own data to ensure sustainability and accountability. It is important. And the third risk is compliance challenge and the cybersecurity barrier. Many international donors impose complex data protection standards that local NGOs are often unable to meet due to the limited technical and financial capacity. We have this example maybe in many parts of the world, but in Afghanistan, we have many examples that many of the humanitarian emergency activity was delayed because that local NGO was not able to fit in this standard. I think compliance framework must be adapted to the local context, ensuring they don't create additional barrier for a small organization. And now let's shift to the opportunity that for the local NGO in related to the challenges that Ito was mentioned. And one of the main opportunity and greatest opportunity for local NGO is to take greater control over the data that they collect, their data. This means moving away from just providing raw data to the international platform and instead shaping data policies to fit local needs. For example, some NGOs have started using open source tools like Kobo Toolbox for the humanitarian, for some research, or for the human rights work they use. This tool allows them to collect and store their own data without relying on the external platform. It's an example. I think we must empower local organizations to manage and safeguard their own data. International donors, such as Access Now or maybe other donors, should support this kind of initiative. And another opportunity is the build the ethical data partnership. Humanitarian organizations should work closely with the local NGO to co-create data strategy rather than imposing top-down solution that may not fit local reality. For example, successful data sharing agreement between the international and the local NGO have enabled real-time data exchange, ensuring local organizations remain in the control while collaborating effectively with the international partner. We need to ensure that data partnerships are fair, transparent, and mutually beneficial for both local and international actors. And finally, we need to invest in sustainable, affordable technology that are suitable for crisis situation. Donors should prioritize funding for the low-cost, scalable digital solution that can be implemented in the area with limited resources. For instance, mobile-based data collection programs have allowed local NGO like Afghan NGO to gather crisis-related information in the real time, even in the area with the poor connectivity. I think investing in the locally method technology will strengthen the entire humanitarian data ecosystem and enable better response to the crisis. In conclusion, the future of humanitarian response depends on ensuring that data is accessible, ethical, and inclusive. Local NGOs must be empowered to manage their own data, and international donors and NGOs must work together to support them in this effort. I think humanitarian data should not be reserved for the big international organization or donor. It must be accessible to all actors in the humanitarian ecosystem, ensuring that data technology fulfill its potential to help those who need it most. Thank you. I hope I responded.
Thank you, Abdullah. That was very comprehensive, but also very specific. And in a way, like what you were presenting has been discussed since at least 2016, I would say. So part of the discussion we'll have next is how can we make this concrete more faster. And I think maybe one of the assets we have now is that all these issues that and challenges that local organizations were facing are now also more and more issues that international NGOs are also confronting. I won't add much in terms of completing, like I put a quote here, but which is essentially what you are saying from a very interesting study from a Somali consulting firm called Somali Public Agenda. So I wanted to highlight and to also show that all over the world we have people that are asking the same question, and referencing a study that CartONG produced, which is also a synthesis of many different work from organizations last year on this question of localization and data, if you're interested in the topic. And now we're going to move to the discussion part. So you have on your screen QR codes that you can try to scan if you're using your laptop, and I will also share the link directly to the people on Zoom. Up, okay. So you can try connecting. You can connect either through the URL I just sent, scan the QR code, or open this website whoclap.com and enter the event code. I would just take a couple of seconds to let people try to load it. Anyway, of course, you will have opportunities to participate even if you're not connected to the tool. Don't worry. So I don't know if you managed to connect, for at least people in the room. Yeah. Cool. So I have a few questions for the audience. The first one are kind of a test run also to verify that the tool is working and to get to know you a little bit. So normally now you should see this first question, which is basically where you are based. It's a very basic question. So you can just click on where you are. Okay, we have our first contributions. So I have 24 people connected, around 10 answered. Okay, well, thank you for answering. I think I will continue, but if you catch up, you can catch up on the questions anyway. Well, we can see we don't have a lot of geographic diversity, and our participants today, which is probably talking about a bit about the issue we were discussing previously, but at least that shows that we are interested in the topic, which is a first step. Next question, also a very basic one, is the type of organization you would fit in for like your main employer or organization you're a member of. Oh, I didn't expect so many people to put other, actually. It's interesting. Maybe we can discuss that after to see how maybe it's my categories that don't represent also your realities. Of course, it's always possible. And apart from that, mostly international NGOs and a few local NGOs. And then a last basic question, it's very broad, of course, is how much do you consider data to be critical to your activities? From 1, like data is not a very important part of your activities, to 5, it's absolutely critical. So just to see how much concern you feel about data in the current audience. Okay, well, the result is pretty logical if you chose to come to this session, but we can see that we have a variety of organizations that express this importance of data in their day-to-day work. I will now move to like a bit more discussion open questions. So you can first like input something here, and then if you want to discuss it a bit more, like the floor is open to participation from the room or remotely. For the remote people, please raise your hand so I can identify that you want to be speaking. And so you can fill the form at the same time that you are discussing. If someone feel like, giving details on that, especially also on impact on the data aspect. If not, we can continue the discussion on that afterwards. People are inputting comments also. It's a possibility. You can type your comments if you prefer. There's a question of partnerships, of course, some organizations impacted directly. And impact of, we'll cover in the next question also this question of global tools and shared tools that are impacted. And on the no category, we have an indirectly comments. The question of direct cut to tools that are at the same time recognized as important for the sector, which is, of course, very big difficulties for many of us. Okay, so I don't see hands risen or people wanting to speak in the room, so I will continue, but feel free to intervene at all time. The next one is, well, it's a bit a repetition in a way if you answered already, thinking on the link to data management. Is like, and the question behind that is also like, if you have to make cuts in your organization, is the data aspect targeted severely, or is it more preserved as a core function? So same principle, you can answer the form directly, you can input something in written, or you can comment also already. And Quito, Giulio, and Abdullah, if some of these numbers raise comments from you, don't hesitate also. And I will be checking the comments as they come also. Yeah, so for some organizations, indeed, it might not be a direct cut, but also like stopping a curve of progress, basically. So yeah, as we can see, like the answers are a bit balanced on this question. Of course, many of us don't know yet, but it's kind of half-half between those directly impacted or not on the data side. Yeah, please. You need to use the mic for the remote people to hear you.
Can you hear me now? Is it? Yeah. I just thought I'd speak just so it's more to open a discussion, just to give some context for ours. So we're a tech non-profit. It's all open source. Most of our work has been in conservation, but now we've moved into the humanitarian sector. And we've been working on, it was me that wrote about the aid tracking technology. So we developed aid tracking technology for, we've worked directly with UNICEF in Ethiopia. And there's so much from the FCDO and from the sector generally, there's a lot of kind of hype about what we've created. And the idea had originally been that we'd had some money from an organisation of the FCDOs to develop the proof of concept and things like that. And then the big idea was always that we would access money from the UK FCDO's Ethiopia Fund, which was supposed to be this huge amount of money. And that was always the route that we were on. And then we've actually just today finished our funding phase, and we were told about 3 weeks ago that it's a categorical no. We cannot access this fund because several reasons. Obviously, the wider context isn't great because it means that there's now a lot of reluctance from other donors to give money. But the FCDO Ethiopia said there's a growing malnutrition situation in the north. Our budget is probably going to be reduced by 50%, and we can't justify ethically giving you money for tech development, even though we totally recognise that this is exactly what the sector needs, because we're essentially taking food away from starving children. So we're now in the situation where we still feel kind of positive about the way it's going, but that's our situation, that we now don't know what the next step is, and we have to look for other sources of funding that probably won't be directly in the we'll have to probably go down an innovation route rather than directly humanitarian. So I thought I'd just share that example.
Thanks. It's a great example indeed. So don't hesitate to jump in if you want to comment, and maybe I'll ask you a follow-up question on how you plan to cope with the situation and your plans, but it will be a question to everybody. Giulio, please.
I think this is. I don't think this is something that we need repeating. It's not ground-shaking evidence, but this anecdote. It's really a testimony of how donors see the tech component disconnected from the humanitarian impact of aid organizations' work. The concept that we can't justify funding tech development, ethical and responsible tech development, because that will take money away from life-saving activities. That clearly sees that we keep perpetrating, and I've put the blame also on myself in my past as working on digital programming. We keep perpetrating this view that tech is separated from the activity itself that is supposed to facilitate. And that also is behind some of the discriminatory reasons that stop allowing local organizations from developing a better ICT capacity in terms of digital training and learning and access to digital tools. And maybe Abdullah, mentioned already in his intervention, but this is clearly where we are. We are still stuck in the mentality that tech is separated or something distinct from what happens in field operations, which again, it's a self-perpetuating kind of flow.
Couldn't agree more, yeah, indeed. So I'll move to the next question. As you can see, these questions are really like conversation openers. The next one is also like, I saw some comments on it, so it's a bit maybe a repetition, but on the perceived impact of pooled and coordination services stopping. So I'm thinking like, cluster services, standby partners, data sharing platforms that have closed. So have you perceived the impact of this yet already, or maybe no, or maybe not yet? And how is it impacting also your work, basically, your activities? And I'd be very interested to have examples, because it's something we've been discussing with other data specialist organizations, but we struggle a bit to measure the impact of that. So use the mic, please, for the remote people. You need to activate it.
This thing? Okay, cool. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Tali, also from a tech nonprofit. So one of the data sharing platforms used widely is the Humanitarian Data Exchange. They are, of course, going to be significantly impacted, if not already. In fact, a lot of my conversations this week have been around the fact that they are back to the strategic plan and thinking about what's going to be prioritized and waiting for the dust to settle. The initiatives that we had going with them for the last couple of years was really about their ultimate goal, which is making it easier for all organizations and individuals within the humanitarian system to be able to access those secondary sources of data that are shared across on that platform, making it easier to interact with the data, look at different aspects of the data, and really not make it a source that's only used by certain actors, really democratizing the use of that data. So we worked with them to figure out how we can use technological advances to make it easy. You don't have to be an Excel expert, you don't have to be a programmer, SQL query person to be able to actually not only look at the data, but do some basic analysis on it as well, and challenge if someone is holding a perspective that's different to your interpretation of the data. That's especially important for local organizations that often will interpret it and say, this is not, actually the interpretation is misrepresented, something is missing, and so on. That initiative now is, it's on pause. We will not know. It seemed really important and it seemed to be in the right direction of bringing more national actors, local actors into the conversation around data, but it is now currently paused and certainly under it has to be decided where that falls, that ease of access using AI to enable data analysis. Where does it all fall? We'll see, but that is it was to lead to more revealing conversations around data quality and how we can improve, but now it all seems to be in question again, to rethink and reframe priorities. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for sharing, indeed. Okay, I don't see other hands risen, so I will move to the next part, next question. So those next questions are really open questions, so you can put whatever you want, and if you prefer, you can also speak instead of typing, of course. So this one is a pretty broad one. It's a bit similar to what we asked to our panelists, but like take it the way you want. Like for instance, it could be like funding cuts that have make you reconsider what data you collect. It can be also questions around data protection and data responsibility around using, I don't know, some big tech tools. It can be like, is there any kind of things that you have changed over the past, let's say, 2 to 3 months regarding the situation, or even before that, if you are anticipating some issues directly, and also in your relationship to local partners? So it's kind of a really open conversation around that. No. And if not, I didn't put it, but why? Or is it because you don't have the resources? Is it because you don't have time currently? Or are you just like happy with the way your system are configured for now? Maybe it's a bit too big of a question, actually. I'm just take the liberty to insist, but for those who would know, like maybe it's because also you're quite confident with like what you built before that is already riding with some like data responsibility aspects and localization, etc. And so if you have good examples that you would like to share, we already have couples from the room. Really don't hesitate. It's also a good time to share initiatives and ideas. Please go on.
So I represent an organization that is entirely commercially focused. Boo.
Not necessarily boo.
But I was really taken by the phrase, the politicization of tech, which clearly has huge impacts on most of the people in this room physically and people online. And it makes me wonder to what extent that politicization is going to impact the things I do. Because I would have answered no. But perhaps it ought to be maybe. There are certain territories, geographies, where we have to be careful as to where data are stored because of the clients that we work with, have certain demands and pieces of legislation. But we have, we use the normal standard of cloud providers and platforms and so forth. I'm a geospatial specialist, so we use Esri's suite of products, which the UN uses, and I'm sure certainly several people outside here, if not within this room, use those products. Yeah, maybe we will be faced with facing the sort of this challenge of politicization. I should add, I'm here too. We're undertaking a piece of work for UNEP, that's why I'm here, around developing guidelines on data collection methodologies in conflict zones. So I'm really on kind of listening and fact-finding.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting testimony from a different perspective also, but which shows that, and I'm sure like many of our providers from the private sectors are asking actually the same questions, and NGOs are asking these days. And I think something interesting that Kito mentioned also earlier is the aspect that, there is no more status quo, and like some places that could be considered as safe in terms of data protection are not anymore. So, of course, we're thinking of the US, but not only. Just to give an example, like, so CartONG is based in France, and like a few days ago, we came really, really close to have a new legislation that forced backdoors on applications like WhatsApp and Signal. So, which could be devastating in terms of security of the exchanges on an anti-narcotics law. And so this is happening everywhere, basically, like some very basic ground rules in terms of data protection are being close to be shaken or shaken. And okay, I don't know who raised their hand first, so Kito, go on.
Oh, please, if you want to finish your thought, please do so. I just wanted to put my hand up before I forgot. I will happily make my comment, and just in relation to kind of what was shared just now about the politicization of tech, I want to be clear. I think that it's not as though technology was not political in some way before, but I think that the places and spaces where, especially in the private sector, people were open to ideas about data being political or politicized, tended not to extend that critique to countries in the global north, right? So there's this assumption that you would be fine in Europe, right? Or you'd be fine to maybe a slightly lesser degree in the States based on, their legislation and so on, but that you didn't need to think about individuals' their own political affiliations or intentions impacting the safety and security of data. And so I think what we're seeing is that that is an assumption that is incorrect, and that I think is based on a lot of really outdated notions, but also that the intentions and affiliations of those who run big tech companies should also be scrutinized when we're thinking about what tools to use, right? Or at the very least, should not be taken for granted. So I think it doesn't even need to be the case that you look at a certain actor and think, well, maybe their values are not aligned and therefore I shouldn't use their tools, although I think that probably is a good idea. And I think that was a lot of the critique, for instance, around WFP's partnership with Palantir some years ago. But also I think the point is that it can be an enormous risk factor, and it can rear its head in an unpredictable way or an unforeseen way. When the larger political landscape changes, those attentions and affiliations come to the forefront, and then that could endanger the data that you're using. So I think the bigger point here is to say that we shouldn't take for granted either way, and we should look for alternatives to big tech tools, potentially private sector held or overseen tools, in order to ensure that humanitarians have some influence and ability to do the other things that are good and important, right? Abdullah points to a lot of really important aspects of giving control over data or access to data to local organizations, rather than just extracting all this data from them and then allowing it to be used to further corporations and their commercial interests, right? Without ever giving anything back to those spaces and places. So when I'm talking about the politicization of tech, I want to be very clear. I don't think it's new. I don't think it's something that I am pointing out for the first time. I think others have for a very long time. But what I think is clear now is that spaces where critiques were not, leveled in the same way or in an equal manner actually should have been right up for conversation, and that the kind of dismissal of, for instance, the Palantir critiques and so on should have been heeded, I think, a lot more seriously. What we're seeing now is what happens when we don't heed that, which is scary, but I think a necessary lesson. And for folks who are in the private sector, I think it's really important also. I think humanitarians, for all of the critiques that we've leveled, do have a lot of self-reflection practices and heed a certain set of principles that reinforce that. And I would really encourage and ask folks in the private sector to try to be thinking a lot more about how to be self-reflective and reflexive if they are trying to support the humanitarian sector that has a very clear set of values, and that we need to now more than ever be doing as much as we can, right, to be supportive and enabling of.
Thanks, Rito. It's very interesting points. And if I can say, I think also we shouldn't antagonize, of course, actors in general. But what we can see also from our perspective is that there is also a gap within the private sector between the really, really big companies, like the big tech, or you call it what they want, who have a global agenda not connecting to the humanitarian sector. And we have a range of service providers, private service providers focused on the humanitarian sector that share our concerns. And so there is a need for an alliance also with these kind of actors that are taking into consideration our specific constraints and fears. Giulio, I see you raised your hand before. Or?
Yes, just to build on the comment that was done before. There is something that is pretty clear to me as a former practitioner involved in digital transformational programs, and it is the fact that, unfortunately, despite the experience that humanitarian actors have in dealing with sensitive information when it comes to pencil and paper. So, for example, you take all your files in the court and you burn everything, or you shred everything if there is a sign of crisis. This is something that has been standard operating procedure since the humanitarian sector was born. There is no such a policy for the digital sector. I know that some experts, including Linda Keto and others, have been like trying to revamp that discussion. By the way, after the Afghanistan experience, like Abdullah mentioned that, like when there was a crisis in Afghanistan and all NGOs started scrambling to destroy data, to avoid data, the wrong data falling into the wrong hands, that was all improvised. And many did not manage to destroy the data, and people suffer because of that. And we still haven't learned nothing, because you look at the US, so the arrogance of the humanitarian sector, the charity, the social space, that years after happens, this, allows the same thing to happen in the US with all due time, with all the tech at hand to dispose of the data properly. And we still allow data to fall into the wrong hands. And I would love to, to really ask, a lot of US-based organizations, what are you doing right now to avoid LGBTQI plus and queer data to fall into the hands of the wrong people? What are you doing to protect migrants, refugees, people that have maybe shaky legal status or that might be vulnerable? What are you doing to protect the data, knowing that a judge or someone could walk through the door of a data center tomorrow and walk out with all those data? Like, what is being done? And the answer, unfortunately, is probably not a lot. And if it's been done on an individual basis, because these policies have not been implemented. And this is how corporate capture happens. We don't plan for the rainy days. We only plan for the handshake of the partnership day. And this is where we fail over and over again. And I think, going back to the question, Martin, that you asked me, this is where we need to build better after this crisis, to stop looking at tech companies as an opportunity for a photo shoot, but trying to deal with them as we will deal with strategic assets, having redundancy in the systems that we build, having the capacity to understand where local storage is better than cloud, and how to bounce back and forth between them depending on the need. And again, and try to make it so that it's integrated into our system, so that we don't have a donor coming and pulling the plug on the whole system the day after, because policies have changed or priorities have changed.
Thanks, Giulio. Yeah, it's a great point. And I'm also thinking of, so Giulio wrote also a study which was very interesting, particularly on the impact of AI a few months ago, and it was a big source for our study. And I remember in your study you were mentioning the example of kind of a small business, like a tech company based in the US, which is basically a farm tool used in many NGOs. And they store a lot of data from your internal organization. And this company has been sold several times by other private groups. And at the end of the day, like humanitarian organizations don't really know who is holding their own data because of this logic of buying and selling companies. And it's typically linked to what you were saying, like thinking of redundancies, thinking of like really vetting these providers, which are core part of our infrastructure now. So I'm just going to check quickly the other comments here. Yeah, the offline capabilities, low-tech solutions, also topics we've been discussing for a while now on our sector. Agnostic tools. Happy to see that. It's also a very big part of CartONG's message. So I suggest we move to my last question, which is more based on like forward-looking, trying to take a positive angle on recommendations. So I built the question around local situation, but it can also be global recommendations if you have some. So of course it's a bit early to say, but we know, and Kito's point was interesting on that many of the recommendations we could be issuing for now already have been there for a while. It's just that we have not been enforcing them. So question is more like, what should be the key messages in terms of reforming humanitarian data management? Sorry, I'm asking a lot of big questions on this panel, but it's also the topic that is like this, so you can take specific examples, of course. And again, feel free to intervene. And Abdullah, you haven't spoken since your open remarks, so don't hesitate also to step in.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I just studied. And regarding the previous question, As Gilio has mentioned, the security and the safeguarding of data is very important, especially in the case of Afghanistan. Because we have many examples, but one is the biometric data of the former people that they was work with the U.S. Army or with the Interior Minister, that all left behind, and now it's a big challenge for the people that they was involved in the past government. But as I mentioned, in regarding to the data management and regarding to the question that you mentioned before, the security and safeguarding of data is very important. Accessibility and compatibility is the same, it's important. And ownership is very important, that the local NGO for the managing of the data or accessing to the data, they feel ownership and they have access to that data. This is something that I think, but in my recommendation that I already mentioned, I noted here, I will be repeated maybe in part of the recommendation part. One was we should be, the recommendation should be invest in the digital infrastructure and the training to the local NGO that help them to kind of the digital literacy or the digital literacy data management for the local small NGO that can help them. Or maybe another recommendation is local NGO must have control over their own data. That is, I already mentioned that, like for the sustainability and accountability and ownership. The other recommendation may be, again, empowering of the local NGO to manage and safeguard their own data. Manage and safeguard, it's more, both is important because at the moment, mostly international donors, international and organization, they have more control and accessibility and owner to that data. And in this part, the donor and the international can support the local NGO. This is something that I think should be considered, can help in the humanitarian area in response to ensure that data accessibility, ethical and inclusiveness. I think for the local NGO, must be empowered to manage their own data and to safeguard their data. They need to empower, they need to have accessibility and the same safeguarding and security and data security, cyber security, especially in the area that the crisis area, that the humanitarian activity need mostly and more attention and this kind of thing.
Thanks, Abdullah. Don't know if someone else, like in the room or online, want to comment. Maybe I'm also checking what you put in the chat. So yeah, always this importance to make sure tools are accessible to local actors. The question of decentralization is also very present in both here in your comments, but in the reflections of the sector now. That's a good point too. If any of you want to expand a bit on yours. Yes, please do.
Hi, thank you. Will from another private tech development company that operates as more or less a nonprofit. We do a lot of work in the humanitarian and development sectors and also earth science sectors. And we're 100% open source, decentralized data where possible. And I just wanted to echo some comments from other sessions here at HNPW of reducing duplicative work and trying to collaborate between humanitarian organizations. That can, in many cases, come at this tension of data retention and privacy. At least within the geospatial side of data, there are some tech advancements and standards to separate the metadata of your data with or from the actual data itself. So you're able to retain ownership, retain access control of data, whether there are licensing restrictions with satellite data or sensitive data that you don't want to be out there. But you can signal that the data does exist and it has some key information like the latitude, longitude, and time scale. So just wanted to flag that here at HNPW, that seems to be at attention, and that this is not a solved problem at all, but there are some open source solutions that can try to achieve both, where data is still retained, decentralized, owned, and locked down, while also, where appropriate, sharing its existence to help with collaboration.
Thanks. A very good point too. And I couldn't agree more with you. So I haven't. It's my first day at HNPW this year. I was not present before, but I've been talking with some people. And from what I heard is that there is it's not new points we are bringing today. Like basically almost nothing we are saying today is really new. But like there is both a traction and an understanding of the issue now, which would be a good moment to start change. I think the key question is to make sure that everybody shares the same understanding, which is kind of, I feel from the comments you're putting the case here, at least, we are only 30 people, so it's a small panel, but it's a sample, I would say, of the sector. And also, I think the next big challenge will be with our donors and our decision makers. And at this point, it's also the purpose of this session today, to build common advocacy and understanding, and hopefully also build synergies, which is a whole part of HNPW. I'm just checking the last comments. One of the key points, of course, and it's also what Abdullah, you are saying, is this aspect to really allow local partners to build their IT and data skills at a basic level to be able to function in a responsible way, because that flows in the whole system afterwards. So we are at the end of my questions, my prepared questions, if I can say. We still have a few minutes, well, not that much actually, for open questions. So if there is something that we were expecting us to cover, or testimonies you wanted to bring that you didn't have a chance to, now is the time. Otherwise, we'll switch to the conclusion. So I'm checking. Nobody in the room. Okay, cool. So a few words of conclusion from myself and from our panelists. So I get started. So first of all, is like we produced in our study a few recommendations. So these are from last October, but I think they are still pretty much up to date with I will of course not read all of them. I refer you to the study if you're interested. But the core idea was really this idea to go towards more sharing of efforts, as you said, pooling resources, building open source and interoperable tools. And also, we built some recommendations for donors and UN agencies. And I would say now it's really restricting mostly to donors because the UN situation has evolved a lot lately on pushing also a mutualized, coordinated approach and funding, in particular, local organizations, as we're saying. So, of course, this whole document is open source, so feel free to reuse it for your advocacy if it's useful, and you'll find in the study examples of this. And so, for my conclusion on the CartONG side, so I wanted to. The only issue is that our figures are from a survey that was pulled up last summer. So I would be curious to know what our panel will answer now, but. Despite the fact that the organization we talked to were identifying big challenges, they were back then quite enthusiastic to the capacity to face these challenges. And as you can see, we are comparing the 2020 situation and 2024, and more than half of the organization were now thinking that they could cover the challenges of data and digital tools in the next 3 years. So it's just an open question like this, whereas in 2020 it was only 6%, so a big raise, including in local CSOs that were quite confident. As I was saying, it would be interesting to update this survey as of now or in a couple of months, of course. But still, to me, what we take from this is that it's not the sector in itself that is not capable of facing the challenges. We have all the ideas, basically. What we need to do now is to act in terms of, as we were saying, working together, maybe streamlining some efforts that are a bit duplicating, building the open source bricks that are still missing to have a fully working system that can take some autonomy from the big tech solutions. And of course, first and foremost, support local actors, which are the building blocks on which the system should be functioning and not the other way around. So I hope, as I was saying before, that this session has helped building this common understanding, and we are, of course, available at CartONG to continue this discussion. It's a discussion we are also having, of course, with other data specialist organizations like IMAP, MapAction, REACH, etc. And so we really hope that together we can both continue maintaining the essential functions that are built in the system currently, but also foster a deep transformation of the system in this challenging time. And we recently published a blog post on this question, which we mentioned on it that we shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater, and currently the system has many flaws. It needs to be reinvented, but it also needs to be preserved on what it's doing efficiently in terms of providing data to serve the most vulnerable people on Earth. And so I will turn to my panelists to a quick word of conclusion. Can be something you missed to mention or some reflection after the discussion with the room. So maybe let's do it the same other way around than without the open questions. So I will start with Abdullah.
For the conclusion, I just conclude very short my presentation that empowering local NGO, local actor to manage their own data is crucial for the more effective and the sustainable humanitarian response. And I think it's very important that the local NGO, they build their capacity, they empower that they be able to manage their data, and they, based on that also, it's very important that they have able to benefit from digital right, access to their data and ownership of their data. But we must focus and support empowering of the local NGO through the technology and build a stronger maybe network or other initiative that local NGO be able to manage their data and protect from their data and safeguarding from data and benefit from the right of access to data to ensure that data justice for all. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And Quito?
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, and thanks folks for sharing some of their experiences as well. I think the main thing is that although responsible data can sometimes seem a little bit, like responsible data management at least, can seem a little bit dry, I actually think that when you dig a little deeper, the purpose of responsible data management is really about helping organizations serve those engaging with humanitarian assistance in a more holistic way, right? Julio said earlier is really true. Technology is part of how these services are delivered, and responsible data is part of our responsibilities to those receiving humanitarian assistance. So I think the big takeaway for me, or last thing thought, is about that I think it's really the moment to reflect more on our relationship as humanitarians to data. Why are we collecting data? What are we wanting to use this data for? What are the deeper reasons, right? When we're collecting data for the purposes of audit, for instance, or the purposes of identification and verification, often in very invasive ways using immutable information like biometrics, right? Why are we bothering to do all of this? And how much of this is because of pervasive suspicion and certain assumptions about those who are receiving and engaging with humanitarian assistance. Some of those things that we maybe don't want to admit are the initial reasons for why this data collection happens in such a wide manner in the first place. And all of this management requires resources. So if we want to ask local organizations to be collecting these resources, not only should they be empowered in the way that Abdullah mentioned, but also they need to be provided those resources. And if we can't provide those resources from throughout the entirety of data collection and across the whole landscape of humanitarian work, then we need to be asking ourselves some questions about what are the alternatives. And I think there may be more room now to have some of those conversations because there is so much upheaval and so much change happening at the same time.
Thanks, Quito. And Giulio for the final word.
I will stretch and expand the call that Quito made and twist a little bit the call and say, I hope and I wish and I will push for humanitarian actors to stop seeing data as something that just happens, especially when it comes to data of affected communities and vulnerable groups, but to focus on it in a dynamic way as part of a living ecosystem, a breathing, living ecosystem that can suffer, that can be sold, that can be torn apart, that can be modified, that can be basically, that can become an asset for other people. The fact that humanitarians are very cavalier about the data that they collect and the way they store it sometimes pushes them to ignore what data represents in the eyes of others. Be them local communities, be that affected individuals, but also big data cartels, those that made like a full business model out of the trading of data, and those that build cloud-based AI machines that thrive because of fresh new data that was not collected before from communities that have been off the grid for a long time and only now are becoming connected through emerging technologies. What does that mean if we collect that data and we just throw it out? What kind of role do these communities play in the future? And what happens to that data and the way that that AI system will manipulate, study, rework, reshape that data and speed it back to those communities through the same 8 actors that have been collecting it in the first place? How does that cycle play out? I will strongly invite all the tech developers in the room, because I heard there are a few, to engage and challenge the humanitarian actors about why they do what they do, what kind of awareness they have about how the data is managed, what happens to the data, to be maybe more critical of the aid sector and their ignorance about what happens once you throw the data out there. Because you folks on the tech sector, you know what happens. And you need to call out humanitarian actors when they are when they lack the conscience, when they lack the awareness of what they do with the system that they have at hand. We also need watchdogs, and it's everybody's job to monitor that the digital pipeline.
Thanks, Guido. Thanks a lot. So it's time to close this session. Just a few final words. So in terms of next steps, possibly. So just to mention that at CartONG, we are trying to organize training sessions for local partners. So we have a partnership with the Bioforce Institute that you might know. We will organize one in Senegal for the West Africa in a few months. And if you are interested, or if you know local actors that could be interested either remotely or on site for this kind of learning opportunities on data and data literacy, don't hesitate to reach us. I also put on the chat for the online participants, and we'll send it by email to everybody, the link to our Learning Corner, which is an open source training platform on data management. We will be publishing in pretty soon also a toolbox on retention, archiving, and destruction of data, which could be useful for organizations that are closing operations, unfortunately. And we have also regular online training cycles for NGOs. So the current one is in French, but sometimes in English too. So for the same thing, like if you're interested on training and capacity building on all the aspects we discussed today, feel free to reach to us. So thank you very much for all that participating in the session. Big thanks to our three panelists. I think it was a really interesting discussion, and the recording will be available shortly too, as well as key outputs from this session. Thank you very much, and have a nice follow-up of conference for those who are here and online too. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.